In God we trust. You can find this phrase on American currency and, if certain state legislatures get their way, on public school buildings everywhere. The phrase is so ubiquitous, I wouldn't blame you for assuming that it's always been part of public life in the United States. But it's actually a relatively recent invention. In 1956, President Dwight Eisenhower signed 2 pieces of legislation regarding this phrase. The first required it to appear on all currency. The second officially designated the words as the national motto. But where did this phrase come from, and why did it suddenly become the country's motto when we got along fine for almost 200 years without one? The answer lies in part with communism.
To understand communism, its basic godless philosophy.
And Karl Marx said that the problem of the world is social, but Jesus said you're wrong.
The official motto, "In God We Trust," reveals 2 kinds of narratives wrapped up in American civil religion. First, the motto demonstrates how Americans use symbolic language to link patriotism with piety. If we're God's favorite nation, then we must be full of righteous patriots, right? The second narrative emerged in the 1950s as politicians used Americans' religiosity to explain how to identify their adversaries. As the Cold War intensified between the US and the Soviet Union, "In God We Trust" became a way to distinguish between the godly us and the godless them. This is piety as nationalism. This narrative states that belief in God is why the United States is a good nation vis-a-vis the godlessness of evil communist states. But where did this phrase, "In God We Trust," come from? It actually originates from the poem that inspired the national anthem, the Star-Spangled Banner. But it's been forgotten because Americans only sing the first stanza of that poem. It reads, "Then conquer we must when our cause is just, and this be our motto, in God is our trust." Francis Scott Key, a lawyer and amateur poet, wrote this poem after witnessing the British bombardment of Fort McHenry during the War of 1812. But it wasn't until after a century of competition with other patriotic songs that President Herbert Hoover named the Star-Spangled Banner the national anthem. These other songs all mention God's providence and protection. For example, Hail Columbia, which is still used as the official vice presidential anthem, and America the Beautiful, where the chorus says, "America, God shed his grace on thee." So why am I mentioning these? Remember from episode 1 of this American Civil Religion series that one of the elements of Clifford Geertz's definition of religion is that it requires a system of symbols. And we find a bunch of symbols when we consider the political rhetoric surrounding official state and military functions. Home of the brave, land of the free, God the author of our liberty. American music evokes these symbols, and we can trace their use back to the country's founding documents, which American civil religion uses as a constant source of inspiration. For example, the Declaration of Independence says that the people of America are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights. When you read these documents, it's not a huge leap in logic to assume that the nation and its people are divinely inspired and favored by God. Now, of course, the story is much more complicated than that, since the founders had a diversity of religious opinions, but the power of that simple narrative explains why Americans have an ongoing debate about, was the US founded as a Christian nation? So, to summarize, the first narrative encapsulated by In God We Trust links patriotism and piety. The second narrative is a battle between the godliness of the US versus the atheism of communism. Speaking in June 1950, President Truman framed the ideological battle between the US and communism as a battle of life and death, good and evil, God and Satan. He said this godless force seeks to destroy all the honesty and decency that every Protestant, Jew, and Catholic has been taught. During the Cold War, the primary slur against communists was that they were godless atheists. In fact, the Republican Senator Joseph McCarthy used this connection as a loyalty test for Americans who he believed had un-American communist sympathies. And President Eisenhower called upon Americans to attend church, any church, as the first and foremost defense against communism. Eisenhower's very first words as president requested the inaugural crowd to let him say a little private prayer.
Before I begin the expression of those thoughts that I deem appropriate to this moment, would you permit me the privilege of uttering a little private prayer of my own, and I ask that you bow your heads.
Eisenhower also launched the National Prayer Breakfast, an annual meeting of religious leaders with government officials that continues to this day, and he would be later baptized by the evangelical leader Billy Graham, who himself claimed that communism was an anti-Christian religion.
Communism and Christianity have a headlong clash.
So, the Cold War was the context of "In God We Trust" becoming the nation's motto. It was a narrative that argued that true Americans believed in God, and you could identify the nation's enemies by their godlessness. Ironically, all of this was happening during a bunch of Supreme Court cases limiting the potential damage of McCarthyism. In 1947, the court ruled that school bus reimbursements to attend private religious schools was illegal. They limited religious instruction inside public schools, and they ruled prayer led by public school officials as unlawful. But this narrative of atheism as un-American remains powerful to this day. Now we can see how these two stories merge together. It's not just that American interests are secured by the blood of patriots who love their country, it's also that these patriots have been of a certain religion backed by similar Christian views about God's providence and grace in relation to their sacrifice. To believe differently, as McCarthy accused communists of during the 1950s, is to be marked as less American. The decision to make "In God We Trust" the official motto cuts to the heart of the debate over Americans' values and identity. In the 1950s, leaders in the US said religion was so fundamental to Americanness that it had to be reaffirmed as its motto, printed on official seals and stamps, and carved into the entrance of Congress. You might not agree with this motto. More and more Americans now identify as non-religious. But conflict is one of the hallmarks of American civil religion. American identity is contested as people stake different claims over what it really means to be American. Next episode, we'll explore this as we examine the controversy surrounding the NFL player Colin Kaepernick when he refused to stand and salute the flag during the 2016 football season. This amounted to a battle over the sacred symbol of the American flag, what it really stands for, and the range of rituals you could deploy to honor that meaning. Thanks for watching, and stay tuned for episode 3 of American Civil Religion.